My husband said, "I'm tired of lying. Your sister is the one I really want." He divorced me and left for her. A week later, a lawyer called me. "Your father died and left you 72 million." What my ex-husband did when he found out. Good day, dear listeners. It's Louisa again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Claire Whitfield, and for 11 years I believed I had built something real. We lived in a craftsman house on Elm Ridge Drive in Portland, Oregon, the kind of neighborhood where people wave from their porches and the maple trees turn impossible shades of orange every October. Daniel and I had bought that house in our 3rd year of marriage, when we were still the kind of couple that argued pleasantly about paint colors and spent Sunday mornings at the farmer's market picking out heirloom tomatoes we were too lazy to actually cook. It wasn't a perfect life, but it was mine, or so I thought. Daniel Whitfield was a civil engineer, methodical and precise, the kind of man who kept spreadsheets for grocery budgets and never forgot to rotate the tires. I was a high school English teacher at Jefferson High, surrounded by teenagers who made me laugh and occasionally made me want to pull my hair out. We didn't have children. That was a wound we had quietly agreed to stop pressing on. 2 miscarriages in 4 years will do that to a marriage. You either grow closer through the grief or you grow parallel. 2 people moving in the same direction, but no longer touching. I told myself we were close. I told myself a lot of things. My sister Melissa was 3 years younger than me and had always been the prettier one, the louder one, the one who walked into a room and rearranged its gravity. Growing up, I had learned to find my worth in other places. In books, in classrooms, in the quiet satisfaction of being the reliable one. Melissa borrowed money she didn't return, canceled plans at the last minute, and dated a rotating cast of men who were all somehow wrong for her in the exact same way. I loved her anyway, the way you love a complicated song you've known since childhood. I should have listened more carefully to the melody changing. The first sign came 18 months before everything fell apart. I came home from a faculty meeting to find Daniel's car in the driveway alongside Melissa's beaten-up Honda Civic. Nothing unusual. She stopped by occasionally. But when I walked through the side door into the kitchen, they weren't in the kitchen. The house was quiet. I called out. There was a pause, just a half-second too long, before Daniel's voice came from the back porch. "Out here!" Melissa was sitting across from him, and when I stepped outside, she looked at her phone with the focused attention of someone who had just been handed it. I noticed, then I let myself forget. The second sign came 6 months later at Thanksgiving. My mother hosted at her house in Beaverton, the same cluttered colonial she'd lived in since we were girls. I was in the kitchen, helping with the gravy, when I glanced through the pass-through window into the living room. Daniel and Melissa were standing near the fireplace, talking. It was nothing. Posture, proximity, a smile that ended too quickly when Melissa saw me watching. Was I imagining it? I turned back to the stove. I stirred the gravy. I did not ask. That is the thing no one tells you about betrayal. It doesn't ambush you. It sits beside you for months, leaving small calling cards, waiting for you to be brave enough to read them. I was not brave enough, or perhaps I was simply too frightened of what reading them would cost me. The evening of March 4th began like any other. I had papers to grade and a glass of wine I hadn't touched. Daniel came into the living room, and I knew immediately, the way you sometimes know in your body before your mind, that something had shifted. He stood in the center of the room with his hands in his pockets, and he looked at me with an expression I had never seen on him before. It was not guilt, exactly. It was relief. "Claire," he said, "I'm tired of lying. Melissa is who I actually want. I'm in love with her. I have been for a while." The room didn't spin. The walls didn't close. I sat very still on the couch where we had watched 1,000 ordinary evenings of television, and I felt the architecture of my life quietly collapse, the way old buildings do. Not with drama, but with a kind of resigned, structural surrender. I didn't scream. I didn't throw the wine glass. I asked him how long. He told me 14 months. I asked him to leave. He did. I sat alone in that house on Elm Ridge Drive for 6 days. I called in sick to school. I ate crackers and reheated soup and did not answer my phone, not even when my mother called 3 times in one afternoon. On the 7th day, a number I didn't recognize appeared on my screen. I almost let it go to voicemail. I didn't. "Ms. Whitfield," said a man's voice, calm and professional. "My name is Robert Ellison. I'm an estate attorney in Phoenix, Arizona. I'm calling because your father, Gerald Whitfield, passed away 5 days ago. He left a will, and you are the sole beneficiary of his estate. I hadn't spoken to my father in 9 years. I didn't even know he'd been sick." "Ms. Whitfield," Mr. Ellison continued, "the estate is valued at approximately $72 million. I set the phone down on the coffee table and stared at the wall for a very long time. The first thing I did after hanging up with Robert Ellison was walk to the bathroom and splash cold water on my face, not because that actually helps, but because you need somewhere to put your body when your mind has stopped processing correctly. $72 million. My father, a man I had last seen at my grandmother's funeral, a man who had walked out on my mother and Melissa and me when I was 19 and never looked back, had apparently spent the last 2 decades building a real estate development company in Arizona and had decided, in the final accounting of his life, to leave everything to the daughter he had abandoned. Not to Melissa, not to anyone else. To me. I called Mr. Ellison back the following morning, clear-headed and careful. I asked the questions you ask when you are an English teacher who has spent a lifetime reading stories carefully. Is the will contested? Are there other claimants? Is this legitimate? Robert Ellison answered each question with the patience of a man accustomed to stunned beneficiaries. The will had been drawn up 14 months ago, which struck me as significant, though I couldn't yet say why. It was legally sound. My father had been of sound mind. There was a small charitable bequest and a modest sum to a former business partner. But the remainder, the properties, the accounts, the investments, went to Claire Ann Whitfield. Me. I drove to Phoenix that week. I needed to see it to believe it. Mr. Ellison's office was on the 16th floor of a glass building downtown, with views of Camelback Mountain going pink in the afternoon light. He was a trim man in his 60s, with reading glasses and a measured, reassuring manner. He walked me through the assets, 8 commercial properties across Arizona and Nevada, a portfolio of index funds, liquid accounts, and a partial ownership stake in a hotel development near Scottsdale that had just been appraised. He handed me a summary sheet. I looked at the numbers until they stopped looking like numbers and started looking like exits. Exits from what, exactly? That was the question I drove home with. Because here is the truth about standing on the edge of a new life. It is terrifying before it is liberating. I was 41 years old. I had a mortgage on a house I could no longer stand to sleep in. I had a soon-to-be ex-husband who had been sleeping with my sister for over a year. I had a sister who had looked me in the eyes at Christmas and said, "I love you, Claire," and meant nothing by it. I had a mother who, when I finally called her and told her what Daniel had confessed, went quiet for a long moment and then said, "Well, Melissa has always had a hard time being alone." As if that explained anything. As if that was a thing I needed to understand. I drove back to Portland with something cold and clear settling in my chest. I had lost my marriage. I had lost my sister. I had lost the version of myself who believed that being loyal and steady and good was enough to protect you from the people who were supposed to love you. Those losses were real, and they were going to hurt for a long time. I was not going to pretend otherwise, but I had also just inherited $72 million from a father who had never given me anything else. And I was going to be very, very careful about what happened next. The first thing I did when I got home was call a divorce attorney. Not the one Daniel had already quietly consulted. Yes, I found that out later. He had started the process before he'd even told me. But a different one. Her name was Patricia Ung, and she had a reputation in Portland for being methodical, thorough, and completely without sentiment. We met at her office on Morrison Street on a Tuesday afternoon, and I laid out the facts plainly. 11-year marriage, no children, jointly owned home, and a significant inheritance that had arrived post-separation. Patricia listened without expression. Then she asked me 3 precise questions about the timeline of the separation, the date of the attorney's call, and whether Daniel had been made aware of the inheritance yet. "He hasn't," I said. She nodded slowly. "Good. Let's keep it that way for now. I want to be honest. I am not a vindictive person by nature. I do not lie awake constructing elaborate revenges. But sitting in Patricia Ung's office that Tuesday, watching her take careful notes in her yellow legal pad, I felt something solidify in me that I recognized as purpose, not anger. Anger is hot and imprecise. This was something cooler. Daniel had made his calculations. He had chosen Melissa, and presumably he had made that choice with some idea of what his future looked like. He did not yet know that the future had just fundamentally changed shape. I was going to make sure the divorce was clean, complete, and entirely on my terms. And I was not going to let anyone, not Daniel, not Melissa, not my mother's quiet sympathy for the wrong daughter, take anything else from me. That was the plan. Simple, legal, irreversible. Patricia Ung filed the divorce petition on a Thursday. I know it was a Thursday because I was standing in the cereal aisle of a Safeway on Burnside when my phone buzzed with her confirmation email. And I remember thinking, absurdly, that the fluorescent lights in grocery stores are designed to make everything feel slightly unreal. I bought oatmeal and drove home and sat at the kitchen table reading the email twice. In re. The marriage of Claire A. Whitfield and Daniel R. Whitfield. 11 years reduced to a case number. Daniel was served 4 days later. He called me within the hour. I let it go to voicemail. His message was controlled. Daniel was always controlled. But underneath the measured tone, I could hear something I hadn't heard from him in years. Surprise. He had not expected me to move first. He had expected, I think, what people often expect from the person they've wounded: paralysis, grief, maybe a long period of desperate negotiation. He had not expected a filing date. I did not call him back that day, or the next. What I did instead was methodical. Patricia had advised me to gather documentation, financial records, account statements, anything that established a clear picture of our shared assets before the inheritance complicated the picture. I spent a week going through files I had largely left to Daniel over the years, because he was the one who liked spreadsheets, and I had been content to trust him with the numbers. That trust had been misplaced in more ways than one. It was in a folder in his filing cabinet. He had left most of his papers when he moved out, apparently assuming I wouldn't look. That I found the first real proof: a credit card statement. Not one of our joint cards. A personal card in Daniel's name alone, going back 22 months. There were charges I recognized: work lunches, hardware store runs, the occasional Amazon order. And then there were the others. A hotel in Cannon Beach, a weekend I remembered because he had told me it was a work retreat. A restaurant in Northwest Portland that I knew Melissa liked, charged on a Friday evening when I had been at a school event. A florist, $67, on a date that I slowly worked out had been Melissa's birthday. He had given her flowers on her birthday, while sitting across from me at my mother's dinner table that same evening, complimenting my mother's pot roast. 22 months, not 14 as he'd told me. 22. I sat on the floor of the home office for a while after that. Not crying, exactly. Something past crying. Something more like recalibration. I had been building my understanding of the betrayal on the number he'd given me, and now I had to rebuild it on a larger, uglier foundation. 2 years? 2 years of watching me grade papers, eat dinner, sleep beside him. 2 years of watching Melissa come to our house for holidays. Had they laughed about me? Had they felt sorry for me? Which was worse? I photographed every page of that statement with my phone and emailed the images to Patricia. She called me within the hour. "This changes the asset conversation," she said. "Marital funds were used. We can document dissipation of marital assets." She didn't sound excited. Patricia Ung never sounded excited, but her voice had a new precision to it that I had come to recognize as engagement. She was interested. Good. Meanwhile, the atmosphere between Daniel, Melissa, and me, to the extent we were in contact, had shifted perceptibly. Daniel had sent 2 more voicemails by this point, the second one mentioning that he'd heard I was talking to people and asking if we could meet to discuss things calmly before this got complicated. I found the phrase interesting. Before this got complicated. As if the complication were something I was introducing, Melissa texted me. She had not contacted me in the week since Daniel's confession. Whether out of guilt or strategy, I couldn't say. But now she sent a message that read, "Claire, I know you're hurting and I'm so sorry. I hope we can talk soon. You're still my sister." I read it 3 times. Then I screenshotted it and sent it to Patricia as well, because Patricia had advised me to document all contact from both parties. Then I put my phone face down on the counter and made myself a cup of tea. Was it painful? Every single day. Did I miss Daniel? Not the man he had turned out to be, but the one I had believed he was? Yes. Did I feel the specific grief of losing a sister, which is different from any other grief because it is so intimate, so built into your idea of yourself? Also, yes, but grief and purpose are not mutually exclusive. I had learned that from my students, from the teenagers who wrote about their hardest years in the essays I assigned every fall. You can carry something heavy and still keep walking. I was still walking. The divorce was filed. The evidence was documented. The inheritance was secured in accounts that Patricia had advised me to establish independently, cleanly, with no commingling. There was no going back now, for any of us. The financial disclosure hearing was scheduled for a Wednesday morning in early May. Patricia had prepared me well. We had documented the credit card statements, cross-referenced the charges with dates and events I could corroborate, and built a clear, factual timeline of marital asset dissipation. When Daniel's attorney, a man named Garrett Foley, who wore expensive ties and specialized in delay, saw our disclosure packet, I watched something move across his face that he quickly composed into neutrality. He had not expected the level of documentation. Daniel sat across the conference table from me for the first time since he had left. He looked good. People in the early flush of a new relationship usually do. But there was something around his eyes that I recognized as a man calculating rapidly. He had known about the divorce filing. He had not yet known about the credit card evidence. And he did not yet know about the full scope of the inheritance. That changed 2 days later. I don't know how he found out. Through courthouse records, through a mutual acquaintance, through Melissa's network of casual indiscretions. But he found out. And the phone calls started. The first call came from Daniel directly, and it was unlike any conversation we had ever had in 11 years of marriage. The controlled tone was gone. He said that he had heard things and that he thought we needed to talk in person as adults before lawyers made everything worse. He said the word inheritance once, carefully, as if testing whether I would flinch. I didn't. Any communication about the divorce goes through Patricia, I said, and ended the call. The second approach was Melissa. She didn't call. She showed up. I came home from school on a Thursday afternoon to find her sitting on my porch steps, our mother's old porch manner, the same posture she'd had at 15, waiting to be picked up from soccer practice. She was wearing a yellow jacket, and she looked, as always, effortlessly pretty, and for a moment, the sheer familiarity of her hit me like something physical. This was my sister. I had known her face my entire life. "Claire," she said, "please, 5 minutes." I stood at the bottom of the porch steps, and I did not invite her inside. "Say what you came to say." What she said was interesting. She said that Daniel had consulted a second attorney, not Garrett Foley, someone new, and that there was a potential argument that some of my father's assets could be considered partially marital because my father had allegedly sent me one card on my birthday 2 years ago, and that constituted a re-establishment of relationship that Daniel's new attorney believed could be argued in certain jurisdictions. It was, legally speaking, nearly frivolous. Patricia told me so when I called her afterward, but it was designed to do exactly what it did: make me afraid. Melissa delivered this information with an expression that seemed genuinely pained, as if she were warning me rather than threatening me. Was she? Or was she the messenger for a strategy they had constructed together over whatever dinner table they now shared? "You should talk to Daniel," she said, "before this gets ugly." "It got ugly 14 months ago," I said, or 22, depending on which timeline we're using. The color shifted in her face. She hadn't known I knew the real number. "Claire, go home, Melissa." She left. I went inside, locked the door, and stood in my kitchen shaking. Not with fear, exactly, but with the specific adrenaline of having held a line you weren't sure you could hold. I called Patricia. She confirmed that Daniel's new legal angle had no real traction, and that she would respond formally if anything was actually filed. Nothing was filed. They backed down. For now. I had known they would eventually, not because they'd given up, but because they were recalibrating. People like Daniel don't abandon strategies. They revise them. I needed to be ready for the revision. But first, I let myself rest. I took 4 days. I called in a personal day Friday, made it a long weekend, and drove down the coast to a small inn in Lincoln City that I had always loved and never had time to visit. I walked on the beach in the morning when the fog was still sitting low over the water and the sand was completely empty. I read a novel I had been meaning to read for 2 years. I ate clam chowder alone at a window table and watched the waves and did not think about Daniel or Melissa or $72 million or the expression on my sister's face when she realized I knew. I just breathed in and out, the way the ocean does. By Monday, I was ready again. The offer arrived on a Tuesday, 11 days after I came back from the coast. It came through Garrett Foley's office in the form of a formal settlement proposal, which was itself a way of making something personal feel procedural. The terms were, on their face, not unreasonable. Daniel would relinquish any claim to the inherited assets entirely, which he had no legal standing to claim anyway, given that the inheritance arrived post-separation, in exchange for a clean split of our joint marital property and a waiver of any claims related to the credit card expenditures. He was offering, in other words, to stop pursuing a strategy that was going to fail anyway, in exchange for me agreeing not to pursue a strategy that was going to succeed. Patricia and I looked at the proposal together in her office on Morrison Street. It's designed to feel generous, Patricia said. It's designed to feel like I'm getting something when I'm giving something up, I said. She looked at me over her reading glasses. Exactly. I declined the proposal. I want to be clear about what I was feeling at this point, because I think people sometimes imagine that a woman with leverage becomes hard and cold, that certainty looks like the absence of feeling. It doesn't. I still woke up some mornings and reached for the empty side of the bed before I remembered. I still occasionally heard a song on the radio that Daniel had liked and felt the specific loneliness of a shared life ending. Grief doesn't obey your plans. But I had learned to hold the grief in one hand and the clarity in the other, and not let one contaminate the other. What helped was having someone to talk to who wasn't Patricia Ung. Her name was Denise Okafor, and she had been my closest friend since we'd taught in adjacent classrooms at Jefferson High for the past 6 years. She was the kind of friend who didn't perform empathy. She just offered it plainly, without inflation or dramatics. When I finally told her everything, sitting in her kitchen over terrible wine on a Friday night in mid-May, she listened to the whole story without interruption. When I finished, she sat quietly for a moment. "How are you actually doing?" she asked. Not "I can't believe Melissa or Daniel is a monster" or any of the satisfying hot take reactions people sometimes offer. Just that. "Some days I'm fine," I said. "Some days I'm not." "That's right," she said simply. "That's exactly right." Denise had gone through her own divorce 4 years earlier. A quieter, less dramatic one, but painful in its own way. And she understood without explanation the particular exhaustion of holding a legal process and an emotional process at the same time, of being required to be strategic when every instinct wants to be raw. She also, practically, started showing up. She drove with me to Patricia's office once when I needed moral company. She texted me every few days, not with check-ins that required performance, but with small, ordinary things. A funny student story, a link to an article she thought I'd like. The texture of ordinary life, sustained while mine was in construction. I also, during this period, joined a divorce support group that met on Thursday evenings at a community center near my house. I went twice and found it moderately useful, not because the specific circumstances were the same as mine. They never are. But because being in a room with other people who understood the particular grammar of loss was its own form of steadying. Daniel and Melissa, meanwhile, were watching. I knew this partly because Denise, who moved in broader social circles than I did, told me she'd heard from 2 separate people that Daniel had been asking around about my state of mind, whether I seemed stable, whether I was making decisions from emotion. The framing was telling. He was building a narrative. Claire is grieving and reactive. Claire is not thinking clearly. It was the kind of groundwork you lay when you're planning a second approach. Melissa had gone quiet on social media, which was unusual for her. She had always been a frequent poster. That silence felt deliberate, observational. They were waiting for me to slip. I had no intention of slipping. I went to school every day. I graded papers. I taught The Great Gatsby to juniors who didn't yet understand why it was sad. I ate lunch with Denise in her classroom on Wednesdays, and I kept every appointment with Patricia. I was boring and consistent and entirely undramatic. The best defense, I had decided, was simply to continue being myself. The self they had underestimated, the self that had apparently been so easy to lie to for 22 months that they had stopped paying attention to her. They were paying attention now. A little too late. They came on a Saturday morning in early June together. I saw them from the kitchen window. Daniel's gray Subaru pulling up in front of the house, Melissa getting out of the passenger side. The domestic normalcy of it was the strangest part. My ex-husband and my sister, Arriving together at the home I had shared with him, in a car she had apparently been riding in long enough that it felt ordinary. I watched them come up the front walk, and I felt something that was not quite any single emotion. Not anger, not grief, not fear, but a kind of flat recognition. So this is what we've become. I opened the door before they knocked. "We need to talk," Daniel said. His voice was careful and warm in the way that voices are when they have been warmed deliberately. Both of us, as a family. I noted the word family. "Come in," I said. I led them to the living room and did not offer coffee. I sat in the armchair, deliberately, the single chair, not the couch, and they sat together on the sofa, which told me something about how they had planned this. Melissa spoke first. She had always been better at the soft opening. She said she'd been doing a lot of thinking. She said she knew what they had done was wrong and that she didn't expect forgiveness, but that she hoped we could find a way through this that didn't destroy everyone. She looked at me with the expression I had grown up watching her deploy, wide-eyed, genuinely pained-looking, the expression that had convinced teachers and boys, and our mother, that Melissa was always, at some level, a victim of circumstances rather than a maker of them. "What does a way through this mean to you?" I asked. Daniel leaned forward. And here, the script changed. The warmth became something more pointed. He said that the legal process was going to be exhausting and expensive for everyone, and that the credit card argument was something his attorney had advised could actually go in multiple directions depending on how certain joint expenditures were categorized, and that he wanted me to understand, genuinely, that he wasn't looking for a fight, but that if I was going to pursue the asset dissipation angle aggressively, he would have no choice but to respond in kind. And that could mean examining certain financial decisions I had made with marital funds before the separation that might look, depending on how a court viewed them, like preparation for divorce. I sat with that for a moment. Was it true? No. Patricia and I had been over every transaction in our shared accounts. I had nothing to hide. But the threat wasn't about truth. It was about cost, about the psychological and financial exhaustion of a prolonged fight. It was an invitation to be afraid. "I understand," I said. "So you'll consider a different approach to the settlement," Melissa said, and she leaned forward with an expression that was almost, not quite, hopeful. "I'll speak to my attorney," I said. That seemed to satisfy them. Daniel's shoulders dropped slightly. Melissa gave me a small, careful smile. They stayed another 20 minutes, and the tone shifted to something almost social. Daniel asked about school. Melissa mentioned our mother. It was surreal in the way that only sustained deception can produce, a simulacrum of the family we had been, assembled in my living room to serve a purpose. After they left, I locked the front door and stood in the hallway. I am not going to pretend I wasn't frightened. I was. Not of Daniel's legal threat specifically. Patricia had prepared me for variations of this, but of the sheer persistence of it, the willingness to sit in my living room and look me in the eyes and perform concern while delivering a warning. These were people who had practiced deception in this house for nearly 2 years. They were good at it. But fear, I had learned, has a second use. It is information. It tells you what you're dealing with. And what I was dealing with, clearly, now, undeniably, were 2 people who had never believed I would actually fight. Who had come here today not because they wanted reconciliation, but because they needed me to stop. That told me I was doing something right. I called Patricia that afternoon and told her everything. The conversation, the implied threat, Daniel's suggestion about marital funds. She listened without surprise and then said, "Good. Let them keep talking. Every conversation they have with you without an attorney present is a gift." I wasn't afraid anymore. I was certain. The deposition was scheduled for a Friday in late July, in a conference room on the 4th floor of a building on Southwest 5th Avenue. Patricia had prepared me for months, but the preparation for a deposition is different from any other kind of preparation. You are not building toward a performance. You are building toward stillness. Stillness under questioning. Stillness when the other side introduces documents you weren't expecting. Stillness when the man you spent 11 years with sits across a table and reconfigures the shared history of your life to serve his legal interest. I wore a blue dress. I had my hair down. I brought a glass of water I barely touched. Daniel arrived with Garrett Foley and the newer attorney, a woman named Sandra Pierce, who specialized in high-asset divorces and had a reputation for surgical cross-examination. Melissa was not present at the deposition itself. She had been scheduled for a separate session the following week. I would later understand why their attorneys had separated them. The first hour was Patricia's territory. She had deposed Daniel carefully, beginning with the basic chronology of our marriage. When we bought the house, when we opened joint accounts, what his income had been in each year of our marriage. Foley objected occasionally, for form's sake. Sandra Pierce watched Patricia with what I recognized as professional respect. Then Patricia turned to the credit card statements. She went charge by charge, date by date, and asked Daniel to explain each one. He had clearly been prepared for this. He had explanations, and some of them were plausible on their surface. The hotel in Cannon Beach was a work event. There had been no work event that weekend. Patricia had subpoenaed his employer's calendar records. The restaurant was dinner with a client. The client, when Patricia's investigator contacted him, had no memory of this dinner. Each answer was precise, and each answer was wrong, and the wrongness accumulated in the room like weather. I watched Daniel's hands during this portion of the deposition. He was a man who had always used his hands when he spoke. Small, contained gestures that I had spent 11 years reading without realizing I was reading them. Now his hands were flat on the table, still in the way that things are still when they are being held deliberately still. I had never seen him work that hard to appear calm, and the effort itself told me everything about how frightened he was beneath the surface. At the 90-minute mark, Patricia asked Daniel directly, "When did your romantic relationship with Melissa Crane begin?" 14 months before the separation, he said. He had said this before, to me. It was his number. Patricia placed a document in front of him, the credit card statement, with the earliest Melissa-associated charge circled in red. The date was 22 months before our separation. "Can you explain this charge?" Patricia asked. What happened next was not dramatic in the cinematic sense. Daniel did not shout or stand up or slam a hand on the table. What he did was pause, a pause of perhaps 4 seconds that felt, in the silence of that conference room, extremely long. Then he said, "I don't recall. You don't recall a dinner at a restaurant you charged to this account?" "Not specifically, no. The restaurant is on record as one your wife's sister frequents regularly. I may have gone there with colleagues." Sandra Pierce, across the table, had gone very still. She was watching her client, the way a pilot watches an instrument panel that has just given an unexpected reading. "Mr. Whitfield," Patricia said, "is it possible the relationship with Ms. Crane began earlier than you've previously stated?" "No." "Is it possible it began approximately 22 months before the separation?" "No." Patricia nodded slowly and moved on. She had what she needed. The record now contained Daniel's sworn denial of the longer timeline, alongside documentary evidence contradicting it. Patricia would later explain to me that she hadn't needed him to confess. She needed him to commit to a lie on record, which he had now done. Perjury is a word that carries weight in settlement negotiations. Both Foley and Pierce understood that immediately. I watched it register on their faces, and I thought, there it is, the moment when a legal strategy stops being theoretical. For the last 20 minutes of the deposition, Sandra Pierce was visibly managing damage rather than pursuing advantage. She asked brief, closed questions, volunteered nothing, and ended the session 10 minutes early with the polished excuse of a scheduling conflict. Daniel left without looking at me. Not out of coldness. I recognized it as something else. Shame has its own posture. Melissa's deposition the following week was, by all accounts, different in character. I was not present, but Patricia recounted it to me in careful detail afterward. Melissa had arrived without the composed certainty Daniel had brought. She had been prepared by her own attorney. She had retained one, finally. But preparation only works as far as your discipline holds. When Patricia asked Melissa to account for a birthday gift Daniel had given her 20 months prior, Melissa said she didn't recall receiving a gift. Patricia presented the florist receipt. Melissa revised her answer. She recalled a small gesture between friends. Patricia then asked her to describe Daniel's role in her life 20 months prior. Melissa said, "A friend of the family." "Your sister's husband?" "Yes. And yet he was purchasing you birthday gifts while denying to your sister that your relationship had begun?" Melissa's attorney objected. Patricia withdrew the question. It didn't matter. The record had what it needed. Melissa left that deposition looking, by Patricia's description, not angry, but diminished. The particular deflation of someone who had believed their own version of events for long enough that being confronted with the documented version felt like an ambush. It was not an ambush. It was just the truth. I drove home from my deposition on a Friday afternoon in July through Portland traffic, with the windows down and the radio playing something I didn't register. And I felt, not triumph, not quite, not yet, but the specific quiet of a thing that has been true for a long time finally becoming official. The settlement was finalized on a Thursday in September. Patricia called me at 4:17 in the afternoon. I know this because I was sitting in my classroom after school, reading student essays, and I looked at the time when I saw her name on the screen. She said, "It's done, Claire." Her voice carried its usual precision, but underneath it there was something I had not heard from her before in months of working together. Satisfaction. I put the student essays in my bag and drove home. The terms were these. I retained the Elm Ridge Drive house in full, along with my individual retirement accounts and a car that was jointly titled. Daniel received his personal retirement account and the contents of a savings account we had jointly held, a figure that represented, after the documented dissipation of marital assets was factored in, considerably less than he would have received had he come to this settlement without the credit card record. Sandra Pierce had negotiated hard. Patricia had negotiated harder. The credit card documentation had done precisely what Patricia said it would do. It had moved the asset calculation in a direction that no amount of skilled lawyering could fully offset, because the facts were the facts, and they were in the record. As for the inheritance, Daniel's attorneys had filed a preliminary motion in late July, arguing that the restoration of contact between my father and me constituted a quasi-marital asset situation that warranted court review. It was the theory Melissa had delivered on my porch steps in the guise of a warning. Patricia responded to it with a 47-page brief that, according to her, was the kind of document that ends arguments rather than extends them. The motion was denied. The judge's ruling was 3 sentences long. My father's estate was mine cleanly and completely, as of the date I received the call from Robert Ellison. Daniel's legal fees had been substantial. He had hired 2 attorneys, filed 1 failed motion, and sat through a deposition in which he had contradicted documentary evidence on the record. The total cost of his strategy was a sum that Patricia described without drama as significant. He had spent considerable money trying to take what was not his, and he had ended up with less than what had genuinely been his to begin with. That is the arithmetic of overreach. I want to be precise about what I felt that Thursday evening. It was not gloating. Gloating requires the other person to still matter to you in an active, immediate way. And what I had arrived at, slowly, through 8 months of depositions and documentation and early mornings on the Oregon coast, was something closer to indifference. Not the cold indifference of suppressed feeling, but the genuine indifference of a chapter that has been fully closed and filed. Daniel Whitfield had been my husband. He was now a case number. Both of those things were true, and neither one erased the other. I was learning to hold that. I listed the house on Elm Ridge Drive in October. I had mixed feelings about this. That house had been mine in the truest sense. I had chosen its paint colors, planted the garden in the backyard, carried 11 years of ordinary life through its rooms. But it was also a place where I had been lied to for nearly 2 years, and I had learned that a home filled with concealed history is not really a home anymore. It is a stage set. I did not want to live in a stage set. It sold in 6 days, over asking. There was one final contact, 3 days after the settlement was signed. Daniel left a voicemail. It was brief, less than a minute. He said he thought the whole thing had been handled poorly by both sides, and that he hoped I could find peace. The phrasing, both sides, find peace, told me everything about how he had reassembled the story in his own mind, as a conflict between equals, a mutual escalation, a thing that simply happened to people. Not a betrayal he had constructed over 22 months in the rooms of our shared home. Not a lie he had repeated to my face through 2 years of dinners and holidays and ordinary Tuesday evenings. In his version, there were no architects of damage, only damage. I suppose that is a more comfortable place to live. I did not return the call. There was nothing in it for either of us. Melissa sent a text 2 weeks after the settlement. It read, "Claire, I'm sorry for everything. I mean that." I read it once, then put my phone away. I spent a few minutes thinking about what I might say. Whether there was a version of a response that was honest without being cruel, that acknowledged her words without pretending they arrived at the right time, or did the work that years of honesty might have done. I couldn't find that version. Maybe it didn't exist. Apologies delivered by text 2 years too late to the woman you helped deceive. I wasn't sure what function they were meant to serve. Perhaps she needed to have sent it. I didn't need to have received it. What I needed, what I had built over 8 months of deliberate, quiet, legally documented work, was a life with its foundation intact. I had protected my inheritance. I had documented the truth. I had let the legal process do what legal processes exist to do: establish facts, weigh evidence, and produce an outcome proportional to what actually happened. I packed the last of my boxes on a Saturday in November. I walked through the empty rooms of the Elm Ridge house one final time. The kitchen where I had made 11 years of ordinary dinners. The living room where I had sat very still on a March evening while my marriage ended. The back porch where I had once noticed something I should have believed sooner. Then I locked the door, left the key with the realtor, and drove away. I did not look back. Not because the past didn't matter, but because the road ahead was finally entirely mine. 18 months later, my life looked like something I had not known how to picture during those gray weeks in March when I sat alone eating crackers in a house that no longer felt like mine. I had moved to Tucson. It was, I'll admit, an unlikely choice. I had spent my whole adult life in the Pacific Northwest, and desert landscapes had seemed, from a distance, inhospitable and spare. But the Phoenix trips for the estate settlement had introduced me to the Southwest in a way I hadn't expected, and I found that I liked the quality of the light there, the way the mornings were cool and clear before the heat arrived, the particular silence of the desert at night. I bought a house in a neighborhood near the Relito River Trail, a low-slung adobe with a courtyard and a garden that I was slowly learning to fill with plants that had no interest in my Portland sensibility. Saguaros and desert willows and a bougainvillea climbing the south wall that turned violent pink every spring. I tended it on weekend mornings with the kind of absorbed, purposeless attention that I had not had room for in my previous life. I had taken a leave of absence from Jefferson High and then in January submitted my resignation. I had loved teaching, genuinely, not out of lack of other options. But 11 years was long enough to know the shape of that work, and I found myself wanting to know the shape of something else. I set up a small educational foundation with a portion of my inheritance, scholarship funding for first-generation college students in Oregon and Arizona, with a particular emphasis on students who wanted to study English or education. The work was modest at first and grew steadily, the way good work does. By the following spring, we had awarded 23 scholarships. I had personal conversations with each recipient, which was the part I looked forward to most, sitting across from a 20-year-old who had figured out, against considerable odds, that they wanted to spend their life in classrooms and books, and telling them that someone believed that was worth funding. I also bought a small house in Portland, not on Elm Ridge, but in a different neighborhood, smaller and farther east, which I rented to a young couple, a nurse and a graduate student, who sent me occasional texts about the garden and once left a small jar of homemade jam on the porch for no particular reason. I liked having a small, tangible presence in the city where I had built my first adult life. Even if I was no longer living it, was I lonely? Sometimes. A new city at 42, without the built-in community of a school and a neighborhood and a decade of friendships, has its own specific quality of solitude. But it was a different kind of loneliness than the one I had felt in my marriage. That loneliness is inhabited, surrounded by the forms of connection, while lacking the substance. The solitude of a life you are building yourself has room in it. Gradually, the way it happens when you stop hiding inside routines, new people entered that space. A neighbor named Rosa, who taught pottery at the community college, a book club that met in a coffee shop on 4th Avenue, full of women who argued pleasantly about fiction and occasionally went for margaritas afterward. Small threads, carefully added. Denise visited me in Tucson in the spring. We hiked Sabino Canyon on a Saturday morning and ate green chili at a restaurant she immediately declared better than anything in Portland. She was the same as she had always been, direct, dry, genuinely interested in how I was, and I was glad for the continuity of her in a life that had otherwise changed almost entirely. I did not keep close track of Daniel and Melissa, but information arrived anyway, the way it does in the age of mutual acquaintances and small world dynamics. Daniel and Melissa had moved into an apartment together shortly after the divorce was finalized. By the following spring, they were no longer together. The details that filtered through were unsurprising in the way that certain outcomes feel inevitable in retrospect. There had been arguments about money. Daniel's legal fees had been considerable, and the settlement had left him with significantly less than he'd planned around. Melissa had lost a promotion she'd been offered, changed jobs twice in a year, and moved into a smaller apartment across town. Daniel had relocated to Seattle. Whether he had rebuilt anything resembling a stable life there, I genuinely didn't know, and I found that I didn't need to. They had made their choices in the belief that I was someone who could be deceived indefinitely, managed with soft apologies and legal pressure, and eventually worn down into quiet acceptance. They had been wrong about that, and the natural weight of being wrong about something, that consequential, has a way of redistributing itself across every other calculation a person makes going forward. My mother and I spoke on the phone more regularly now, carefully and not without difficulty. She had visited me once in Tucson in February, and we had sat in my courtyard drinking coffee and talking about small things. It was not everything, but it was something. I went to the Relito Trail most mornings before the heat arrived. I was writing again, essays about things I had thought about for years without having the time to put down. One October evening, I sat in my courtyard watching the light go sideways across the Santa Catalina Mountains, the peaks shifting from tan to pink to a deep, fading rose, and I felt, quietly, without drama, that I was where I was supposed to be. Not because everything had worked out perfectly, but because I had made it here, carrying everything I needed to carry. And that, I had learned, is enough. They said I was too trusting. Maybe I was. But what I learned is this. The people who underestimate you because you're quiet, they leave evidence. And evidence, gathered patiently, tells the truth that liars cannot afford to hear in court. Protect yourself legally, document everything, and never mistake someone's silence for weakness. If you were in my position, if the two people you trusted most turned against you, what would you have done? Would you have walked away quietly? If this story stayed with you, share it, leave a comment, and thank you sincerely for listening to the end.